20 frames per second electronic shutter. A lot of you wanted to know, does it work in the field or does the rolling shutter effect ruin your images? I didn't know myself, so I went ahead and tested it out. So what comes to mind after using the electronic shutter in the field? First of all, it's so fast. You don't even notice that you're taking hundreds and hundreds of pictures simply because the camera is completely silent, and the only way you notice you're taking images is actually by looking at the counter of the remaining images just rapidly going down. Otherwise, you can't even tell that you're taking images. There's essentially no lag or blackout between the pictures, and because it's completely silent, it just doesn't even feel like you're taking images. At one point, I was just holding my camera and I didn't even notice I was pressing the shutter button lightly, and I took like 200 images off the ground before I somehow saw the counter running on the back of the camera. I'm like, oh, I think I took a lot of images just then. So for me, actually having a completely silent shutter was something I had to get used to, but it was pretty cool to use in the field, and I really want to share my results with you now, where I took some images with the electronic shutter, some images with the mechanical shutter. So here's the first set of raw images in Fast on Image Viewer, and I'm just going to flick through them, and afterwards I'm going to show you another set of images, and then I will reveal which set of images was taken with what shutter. So you can just have a look and think for yourself, can you see anything that looks like rolling shutter in either of these sets, and then have a guess as to what set was taken with what shutter mode. So here's the first silver gull flying towards me overhead, and then it's even starting to look down on me, giving me some really nice images, and they're all nice and sharp. Very good, camera tracked this one very well. It's another set of images with the silver gull coming in against a really nice dark background. I'm actually struggling to keep on it, but the camera stays on the silver gull, following it against the busy background, getting a bit of movement, bit of action, bit of background, so we can see a few different scenarios where we might spot a rolling shutter effect. There's the bird flying past me now. Camera stayed on it nicely, nice and sharp. There's another silver gull flying really fast past me, doing a mid-air banking maneuver and then drifting off to the side. There's another gull, a bit dark, but it's doing a nice up and down wing motion. So that was the first set of images. Looks pretty good, some nice flight shots, really good tracking with the camera. So let's look at the second bunch of images. Here's now the second set of silver gull images. Again, camera nicely tracks it, nice and sharp against really nice looking sky. Love those clouds. Camera still following it nicely. Now the gull starts hovering with the wings up and down and around. Slightly struggling to stay on it, but the camera managed to balance that out and help me to stay with the bird. And then it takes off, still nice and sharp. Another set, silver gull coming towards me, drifting off to the side. Now starting to turn right in front of me. Camera managed to stay with it really nicely. I was pretty impressed with that. Now it's coming down against the background. I'm struggling to keep it in the viewfinder. So there's our two sets of images. And looking at these two, I couldn't really spot the difference. Could you? Let me know in the comments. So what was what? The first series of images that I showed you was the electronic shutter in high plus mode with 20 frames per second. And the second set of images was the mechanical shutter with 12 frames per second. Pretty interesting, isn't it? There was basically no noticeable difference in these shots at all. Did you spot any? Overall, I was quite impressed that you could actually not see a difference, but I've done some more testing because surely there has to be some rolling shutter effect at some point. But before we get into that, I just wanted to share some more thoughts on the autofocus. And what I noticed shooting more and more birds in flight, that the camera is really good as long as it can see the bird's eye. So for instance, anything that flies below you or past you kind of sideways, the camera usually jumps right onto the head and the eye and stays with the bird, and you get usually some really nice sharp images. Even when the bird is coming at you, the camera seemed to do pretty well. The only time I noticed the camera struggling was whenever a bird was kind of coming towards me and then going up over the top of me. In those cases, the camera focused on the feet and the tail. So as long as the camera can see the bird's eye, it's amazing. But when it loses track of the eye, it can struggle at times. But so far I've been pretty impressed, and even when I took these images of the flying silver gulls, there was many occasions where I got many more keepers than I would have ever gotten before with any other camera. And I also tried the autofocus on myself with the human eye autofocus, and I was very impressed as well, because I could basically take some selfies with the camera without really having the need to always make sure that I'm focused on my eye or not moving around. The camera would simply just stick to my eye, and all the pictures I took were beautifully sharp on the eye. I've also tried the human eye autofocus with my daughter, and it was really amazing because it just stuck to the eye at all times. She could move around, do whatever she wanted, and I could actually hold my camera forward and talk to her, so I could make sure she's entertained and looking at the camera, and I'm just out of the corner of my eye keeping composition, and the camera completely took over the autofocusing for me, and literally every single shot was sharp. So I was very impressed with that. So that's the autofocus update, and I've done some more tests to really find out at what point that rolling shutter effect kicks in, because clearly with these silver gulls there was just not enough wing movement or not enough speed to actually create that rolling shutter effect. I took up my drone because I thought, what can I find that's really fast spinning? So the drone propellers should be a very good test to see what the differences are between the different shutter modes. So let's have a look at that. So when we look at these drone examples, we can see that in the first example with the mechanical shutter, I have motion blur because even a 1/8,000th of a second wasn't enough to freeze the motion on the drone's propellers. But we can see they're all a nice straight shape with just a little bit of motion blur. But if we swap over to the electronic shutter, you can now see that when we flick through the different images with the electronic shutter of the drone's propellers, that different positions are just fairly out of shape and sometimes looking like they're bending or turning or just a bit blurry. So this is where we can definitely now start to see the rolling shutter effect coming into play. However, I think if we compare it to other electronic shutters that I've seen in the past, this is not as bad. Here at least you can kind of still see the shape of the propeller, even though it's a lot more bent than what it would be in normal life. I think the rolling shutter effect is definitely there in this example, but this would also explain why it wasn't so visible when I was panning with the seagulls in flight, simply because they were flying slower and me panning with the bird negating some of that rolling shutter effect. It seems to be the worst effect if you're static and your subject is moving really fast in some sort of direction. I did another test as well where I just went onto the street and panned my camera past a static power pole really fast and then a bit slower to see at what point the rolling shutter effect kind of starts to kick in. So when I go past really fast like this, you can see extreme distortion. Whereas if I go past it at a more normal kind of pace, you can see a tiny bit of distortion or rolling shutter effect, but it's really not that bad. And then here's an example what the pole looks like if I don't move at all. So what are the main factors influencing whether you can see a rolling shutter effect in your images or not? First of all, I think the angle you're shooting at. If something is coming towards you or you're shooting at it on an angle, it's less likely that you're seeing the rolling shutter effect compared to something going from the left to the right or the right to the left straight through your frame, as you can see with my power pole example. It also depends what you're photographing. If you're photographing something that naturally has a lot of straight lines, it will be a lot more likely that you see some sort of rolling shutter effect compared to nature photography, where we often have out of focus backgrounds that are very sort of non-distinct. So seeing a rolling shutter effect in there is less likely. So that helps us out in nature photography. The second factor is your speed and your subject's speed. and also whether you and your subject are both static or both moving, or one of you is moving and the other is static. So if you're static and your subject is going really fast past you, or if your subject is static and you're panning really fast, in both of these cases I would expect to see a rolling shutter effect, simply because one being stationary, the other moving really fast, seems to really pronounce that rolling shutter effect. Whereas if you're panning with a bird, for instance, that's flying in one direction, you're following it at the same speed, it's less likely to see the rolling shutter effect in this scenario, simply by both of you moving in the same direction. So what are the main advantages of using the electronic shutter? First of all, it's completely silent. So if you're inside a church or photographing a really skittish animal, having a completely silent camera can be of great advantage to you, because no one will notice that you're even taking images. And you don't even have to use the really high frame rate with the electronic shutter. You can actually dial it back, so you can just take 3 or 4 or 5 frames per second at a much nicer, slower speed, and getting your really nice images in complete silence. So I know that that will come in handy a lot of times. The second advantage of it is that it's just super fast. So if you need a lot of different poses, or you're just shooting something that's really going fast past you, it's nice to have that option to have a really high frame rate that will allow you to get a lot of different wing poses you can choose from. However, that speed also comes with the drawback of having the rolling shutter effect. So at times, and especially with fast action where you would actually want to use the electronic shutter, you're also getting the worst rolling shutter effect. So that's a bit unfortunate, because if you're static and your subject goes really fast past you, or your subject is static and you're panning really fast past it, there will be a lot of times where you can see that not so nice looking rolling shutter effect. However, if you are going to pan with your subject at a similar speed, and especially if the background is quite out of focus, I think you can negate a lot of that rolling shutter effect, and the electronic shutter can be really effective to use. So for instance, I can see having trouble shooting hummingbirds where the wings go up and down really fast, or shooting like a baseball game where the batter hits the bat. So I would expect that the bat might look bent or be like a bit kind of cut off, or same with the hummingbird wings, they might look bent, or there might be little bits missing, or the wings will just look too long. So my recommendation would really be to you that before you use the electronic shutter, try and replicate what you're going to shoot. Take a few test shots and see, the way I'm shooting today, is that going to affect the rolling shutter effect? Am I going to see it in my pictures, or will I be fine? Another thing I noticed with that 20 frames per second frame rate, you're filling your buffer really quickly and you're hitting it pretty quickly, even when you're using the CF Express card. So that's something to be aware of as well. You can take a lot more images, but you're also hitting the buffer a lot quicker, especially when you're shooting a bird that's flying past you and you start shooting too early when it's still quite in a distance. It happened to me a few times that by the time the bird got into the good spot, I was already hitting the buffer. So that's just something to be aware of, and keep in mind that because of the 20 frames per second, you're hitting that buffer pretty quickly. That didn't really happen using the mechanical shutter and the lower frames per second. For normal day-to-day use, I will definitely stick to the mechanical shutter, because I get guaranteed the best image quality, no rolling shutter effect, and it's plenty fast, and I have a bigger buffer available. Or not a bigger buffer available, but I'm not filling the buffer as quickly. So if you need silent shooting mode, really fast frames per second, and you're able to kind of test out what you're shooting and make sure you're not being affected by the rolling shutter effect, then I think the electronic shutter can be really effective to use. But as my general recommendation, I would say stay in that mechanical shutter mode. I hope you enjoyed today's video and I could give you a little insight into the world of the electronic shutter versus the mechanical shutter, and show you when the electronic shutter can shine and where its limitations lie. So let me know in the comments down there, have you used the electronic shutter before? Are you liking it? Did you struggle with the rolling shutter effect? What are your experiences? I'd really like to know. Also down there in the description, check out my ebooks and videos that will teach you all you need to know about bird photography and will take your bird photography to the next level. Also make sure to give me a thumbs up for this video, subscribe to my channel down there, and I will see you in my next video very soon. And also I'm really hoping that this lockdown in Australia will end very soon, so I can take the camera back out to the field and show you some more action.